Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW. Do you need a web application security solution that can improve your detection rate and enable easier remediation? Acunetics has a fully automated solution that can detect and report over 4,500 web vulnerabilities. Fast and scalable, it can scan thousands of pages without interruption, including HTML5, JavaScript, and single-page applications. Acunetics provides accuracy with the lowest false positives by combining black box and white box testing. For more information, visit acunetics.com/securityweekly. Hard-coded credentials can be trouble, but not as much trouble as a vulnerable DevOps environment. If you want protection without the hassle of security slowing you down, CyberArk, the #1 provider in privilege access security, has the solution for you. With CyberArk Conjur, developers can easily secure secrets across any DevOps toolchain or platform, whether your application runs in the cloud or on premises. Eliminate the headaches of managing secrets and try Conjur open source for free with no strings attached. Visit conjur.org/ASW to get started today.
Welcome back, everyone, to the application security news for the week of November 4th. So, Paul, diving right in, a nasty DHCPv6 packet can pwn vulnerable Linux boxes. System D for the loss?
Yeah, pretty much. I don't have a really good feeling for like how on by default this feature is. I'd imagine it varies per distribution, which really... Well, that's my other rant, is Linux distributions just change stuff for the sake of changing stuff, and I'm not quite sure why they changed it. Like when I upgraded to Android 9, is that the Pi release? But the time on my phone is now on the left hand as opposed to the right hand side. Like why?
It's differentiating from Apple.
Is that their research to support that time is more easily consumed on the upper left-hand corner as opposed to the upper right-hand corner? Is that configurable? I don't know. I went through some of my settings over the weekend, but yes, I was late to the party upgrading my phone. Shame on me.
I mean, so I don't know if this particular library is going to be on your Android phone, but it's definitely on a lot of Linux systems, which I think...
Oh yeah, sorry, that was a total divergence from what we were talking about. Yes, this is on your Linux distribution. Basically, and it's when you read this, you understand that it's in a vulnerability in the client, which means you can deploy a malicious server that exploits the clients, right? The direction is very important when we're talking about it. I like it as a pen tester, or because I can just drop one server in. If I respond first, as in DHCP, then if you're vulnerable and the exploit works, you're done. Which, I mean, a lot of variables there.
And in this case, too, I mean, it could be similar to the Winduke vulnerability back in Windows 95, where if you get it wrong, it just crashes your system, right? Like now that was a reliable attack against Windows back in the 90s. But this is in System D Network D, and it's an out-of-bounds heap write in the DHCPv6 client. So basically, as you said, if you've got a server or even a user system out there on the internet that's got DHCP, or rather IPv6, and it's accepting DHCPv6 network packets, then it could actually be triggered by an actual server ID with a character length of 493 characters or longer. So basically what ended up happening here was they don't check the bounds of the server ID that it's being provided as part of the packet to the DHCP client on IPv6. So now you end up writing into the heap space, and that's potentially going to allow you to get code execution depending on where you land and how you go ahead and send that across. But yeah, not too good, because this is actually on a lot of systems as well. Ubuntu, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, as well as, of course, Debian, Fedora, CoreOS, Mint, and SUSE Enterprise Server are all potentially vulnerable, although apparently RHEL 7 doesn't have the vulnerable component by default, whereas the rest of them seem to. So yeah, not great. I mean, I know a lot of people have been hailing IPv6 as kind of the great savior to the way that we do network configuration. And this is just a matter of, hey, do we check that the ID is, within the bounds of the memory that we set up? Now, I imagine, especially for systemd, this is probably written in C++, right? So they're
Yeah,
probably
most
doing
likely.
memory allocation
Yep.
dynamically.
Yep.
Or, well, they have to do it, but they're probably written it in dynamically, and they just never check the bounds for it. So, yeah, not great, but that'll be interesting to see how that all kind of shakes out. The other one, story number 3 under bugs, breaches, and more, was the xorg or x.org vulnerability. Now, Paul, you were referring to this during the break as X, which I believe x.org is the open source component that has been adopted from X way back in the Unix days. So this
Yeah,
is
because
CVE.
it was funny in that there's a little note there that when I was first learning Linux and trying to understand the graphical in Unix, right, the graphical subsystem, I would refer to it as X Windows, which is incorrect. It's actually X, right, which is the subsystem largely found in commercial versions of Unix like Solaris and AIX and such. X.org is the open source implementation of X, which gives you that graphical client server capability, all stemming from back when there were physical terminals, right? Connected to a terminal server. There were physical terminals, which kind of explains why some of the vulnerabilities might exist, because when this was created, there was no network really. You were actually physically connected, or I guess there was a network in more modern Unix systems, right? A network that that's how you would load the terminals. And they
Yeah.
weren't connected to the internet, which is the other thing. So if it was network, they really weren't considering vulnerability. The person who introduced and taught me some of the Linux fundamentals came from a university when they would have that, and described all kinds of hilarity that he would do, just basically abusing the fact that there was like no authentication for your X connections. Similar
That's kind of
here,
scary.
right? Yeah.
So in this case as well, what it is it's a CVE 2018-14665. So that's Narendra Shindi,
Mm-hmm.
who is the researcher that found this. And so it goes through or back to 1.19 for the version number. And what it allows you to do is it's an incorrect command line parameter validation. So this is similar to something we talked about a few weeks ago, Paul, which was, I think, the Git vulnerability that had kind of the subcontained packages inside of your repository that also had a flag that I was reading as a command line argument. So same sort of problem here. You can get privilege escalation via the -module path argument or the -log file argument because of the ability to arbitrarily overwrite files on the file system. So suddenly, if you overwrite these files and then you run them as arguments, you've got code execution because it's now reading that file as an input and then off to the races.
Yeah, it's a very trivial and reliable exploit because it doesn't, in fact, take advantage of any kind of memory manipulation. It's really just using Linux or Unix as it's intended, basically.
Yeah, right. Right. It's just command line flags and just
Yep.
bad write parameters, or effectively bad input validation for those parameters, right? So
Yep.
again, it's a situation where it should be, hey, we have maybe predetermined or at least well understood parameters. Maybe we should define those with a regular expression check just to make sure that they are in fact what they think they are, and don't have, I don't know, OS command characters in them. So yeah, that was one that I saw and I was like, yeah, not great. Especially because it's, again, input validation, output encoding, all sorts of very traditional problems that could have been fixed years ago but haven't been.
And privilege escalation, and also more valid on OpenBSD, as you can trigger it from a remote SSH session. You don't have to be on the physical terminal. The other Linux operating systems, you had to be on a physical terminal to get this privilege escalation.
Yeah, so again, OpenBSD, especially for those out there, I mean, there's probably a smaller subset of people that use OpenBSD, but there's still enough of them out there that not great, get you to the patchery, as it were, because yikes, like that could definitely, if you've got X forwarding enabled via SSH,
Yep.
yeah, bad day.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people tend to do that, especially if they've got like a box at home that they want to be able to
Yeah, remote
work from.
management, sure.
So One of the other ones I wanted to make sure that we talked about for this segment was story number 3 under If You Build It, They Will Come, which is the US Department of Defense released guidance on detecting Agile BS, which I thought was just absolutely pure gold. So in this, they actually talk about what the Agile principles are and effectively what the maxims that they use inside of the Department of Defense might otherwise refer back to, but they have some key flags that a project is not really agile. So I'm just going to
Mm.
read through a couple of them, and Paul, you can feel free to jump in as well. I think one of my favorite ones, though, is that nobody on the software development team is talking with and observing the user of the software in action, and that they mean actual users of the actual code, which it's almost like, okay, so what you mean to tell me is you don't know who the customer is and you don't know how they're using it. Ergo, it's not really truly agile. And I thought that was
Mm-hmm.
just hilarious, right? It's communication, right? Communication, coordination, collaboration. And apparently people aren't doing it and they're calling them out, which I thought was awesome. Were there any of these that stood out to you, Paul?
No, I thought this whole document was really awesome, especially coming from the Department of Defense. I thought it was written in more of like something that Security Weekly would talk about and publish as BS, right? But here's the
Right.
Department of Defense doing it, so I thought just for that reason it was really awesome. Their graphic describing all of the tools is equally as awesome, actually. And
Yeah.
really, just looking at that graphic, Keith, and you can in the show notes again. We link to it, and there's a PDF that you load, and it's just all of the tools you need in your tool chain to do DevOps and Agile are kind of listed out there, which that's actually super helpful.
Yeah, yeah. So that one is really good. It's actually on the top of page 3. The other one as well is actually at the very bottom of page 5, or the top of page 5, is the graphical version of the paper, which is it's got like a sunshine in the middle, and it's
Mm-hmm.
got kind of some diamonds with the questions and just simple yes or no, right? And it points down to like a puddle on the floor as Agile BS for no,
So
and
great.
across to the sun for yes.
Yeah, it's so great. I love it. I love it.
It's just like it's the print that out, put that on
Yeah.
like the cooler, you know?
But I like that as a cultural, reminder and to drive people in the right direction. In that light, I think this is very effective communications in leadership. I liked
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, it was a very well thought out piece. The questions that they have for either the program leadership or the customers and users or program management or programming teams, like they break it down into sections with really good questions. So, for example, how do you test your code? And it also gives you the wrong answers, which is we have a testing organization, which is it's just like yeah, they really do not pull their punches here. So, as a document, number 3 under if you build it, they will come. Yeah, go pick that up, read it, highlight it, print it out, and share it with everyone because it is just pure gold. Um, Moving on, though, I did want to make sure we talked a little bit about the 12 malicious Python libraries found and removed from PyPy. Story number 2 under If You Build It, They Will Come. Now, this was similar, Paul, to some of the things that we've seen out of NPM, is kind of a big
Mm-hmm.
one that comes to mind, where they had typo squatting domains. I don't know if you wanted to go into that further, because I know a couple of years ago you talked specifically with I'm forgetting the episode, but you interviewed someone on their project on doing typo squatting tests on npm. And so this is again the same sort of thing that we're seeing now with Python libraries, where people are typo squatting and putting in malicious code inside of fully functioning libraries. So that
Yeah.
was crazy.
And I think this speaks to as you mentioned earlier, Keith, a trend that we're seeing in it's been there for a long time, right? But as we have so many more projects that give you a base level of functionality and then allow people to develop add-ons. I mean, of course, we can talk about the large ones like browsers and phones. I even think, Keith, if you set those aside, there's some lessons to learn here, but if we look at the ones that are just involved with the coding process, right, or software development, that we should have some guidance for these because we've seen so many different iterations of basically I'm trying to poison the watering hole, right? And so I've got npm or I've got Docker's another example. And there's lots of different examples where I can get the base functionality, aka in this case, Python. I use a package type manager. In this case, it's not pip, but it's Python package index or PyPy. And there's several ways you can poison the watering hole, right? You can do the typo squatting and disrupt the namespace essentially to trick people. You can just take over the credentials of one of those add-on packages and insert it. You can steal their trusted certificates is another kind of trick. Like if you can't get their exact credentials, if you steal their code signing cert, you can sign code and potentially upload it, right? So there's a couple of different ways that this is being exploited. So I think there should be guidance, and also you can create a brand new library, right? I can just create a library, says it like the flashlight application, right? Say that it does one thing, but it really does all this other stuff. And what can the project or organization do to help prevent those? And I think there should be, if there is, please point us to it so we can reference it on the show. But I think there should be you should do some code checking. You should do some namespace protection. You should have guidance for your users, including two-factor authentication for the add-ons that they're developing and uploading, right, and checking in. So all those things I think come into play as this is becoming more and more of an attack vector. Back in the day, I think we used to talk about it as you download open source software and someone has, uploaded or somehow poisoned that particular code. The whole market has kind of exploded. It's not just open source software, right? It's all of these different ecosystems that are running into this problem.
And part of the way that they do that, at least with Node, right? Because that's kind of the big one that we see a lot of people using nowadays for everything from Electron to web applications. Is they have the Node Security Project, or NSP, or Node Security Platform, excuse me, that is now bundled into NPM or Node, I think, because there was the whole acquisition of Uplift.
Yep.
And so now if you run, like NPM init or what have you, right? Or NPM or Node run or NPM run, you can actually get almost like a linting check for security checks against, potentially vulnerable packages. But I imagine that they could also, of course, kind of continue to accrue a list of things that were typo squatted as these are not in fact legitimate packages. And just kind of keep a running list of those, because eventually you're going to run out of potential typo squats for any given thing. Now, what was interesting about this as well, Paul, speaking of pip, so I was reading through this a little bit, and in one section, they do talk a little bit about the fact that pip itself is actually going to go ahead and do some execution of basically the libraries themselves. So the setup.py file contains a set of instructions that Python library installers like pip will execute automatically when downloading and setting up a new package inside of a Python project, which is where this is potentially so bad, because if you're going to set up and execute and you've suddenly got these malicious Python libraries that, by the way, are packaged in such a way that it's effectively the true library plus extra code, right? So you never know that it's an actual malicious library because it works, it functions, and it does exactly what it says it's supposed to do, except now it has that extra code that maybe, offloads your certificate signing, or maybe your private keys, or, any number of things that could be potentially offloaded depending on where you're running this, right?
Right. Yeah, and another example is Mac ports. Is that the one that I used? And what's the other one? There's a couple of packages like that on OS 10 that give you all the open source components, right? They could also fall, and I feel like that's bad because you may just have people that, I want some more tools, and you can just go run one command, go install this, and it does a whole bunch of crap in the background. If any of that is been backdoored or Trojaned in some way, you could fall victim to it. So.
Yeah, it's going to be one of those things that I think we start to see more of, especially in the era of open source and the whole movement toward making use of open source tools. I know we've seen a number of articles citing something like 70% of most development today is done with open source of some kind, right?
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean that the whole project relies on open source, but that might be a core component. So maybe it's a struts library, for example. And so yeah, that can be a real problem with especially typo squatting. And again, forgive me, I'm forgetting which Paul Security Weekly episode it was, but it was a couple of years ago. You had a guest on that was talking specifically about doing this for NPM to some success, which is kind of scary. But thankfully, I think that more groups like PyPy or even the NPM folks are doing a better job of this. Especially, they've actually blacklisted that listing on PyPy at this point. So Colorama, I think, is the one that they were talking about specifically in the article. Right now, they've blacklisted the typo squats against what was the actual legitimate package. So that's one solution, unfortunately. So, Paul, I know that there were several other stories we had in here. Were there any specifically that you wanted to jump into?
The threat playbook, threat modeling as code, sounded
Oh,
interesting.
yeah. So that was really interesting. That's under Learning and Tools number 3. So this was done by Abhay Bhargav and the We45, or the folks at We45, which is, I believe, a company that he works for.
Mm.
And so what this is it has a kind of YAML-based playbooks. It's yet another YAML project that automates the testing of your application for security vulnerabilities and actually does it with a number of different tools. So he actually did a demo of this at Black Hat Arsenal this year. So Black Hat USA Arsenal talks. He also gave a demo of this at AppSec Day when I was there. And so what this does is it effectively allows you to define, and he has some already kind of predefined for him of certain vulnerabilities, so SQL injection or input problems like XSS, etc. And what you end up doing is you end up running this effectively alongside your other Jira unit tests, and it pulls things like libraries for Zap, Burp, Arachne, etc., and runs them automatically. And you can actually, it's got a nice kind of command line view, and then outputs very nice kind of like, not like stack trace per se, but trees that connect back to one another of, okay, here's the code path that I took to execute this vulnerability in your application based on the tests that we run. So there's actually a video on the end of his Git book. So if you go to we45.gitbook.io/threat playbook, there is the OWASP AppSec California 2018 talk that he gave that highlights and the demo of the tool itself. And this thing, it was just very, very cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then giving this away for free is really cool too. I like it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like that's going to be a really great tool for people's tool belt, especially as there's all sorts of problems when it comes to automating security testing as part of your development process. Well, this one gives you pretty definitive guidance as to how to go back and replicate it as well. Just an awesome tool all around. The other one that I thought was kind of interesting as well was NetAssert. So it's a network security testing for DevSecOps workflows tool set, and it's made specifically for testing things like Kubernetes. So traditional testing of network security was run with Tenable Nessus or the Rapid7 Expos, now Insight VM. But these days when you have networks spinning up and spinning down very quickly, and they're usually either Dockerized, or in this case maybe they're Docker running on Kubernetes as the orchestration layer. You got to test to make sure that those network layers are secure. I mean, Paul, you've run into some issues with that where you've actually had to kind of go in and figure out authentication, if I'm not mistaken, with your Docker network. Is that correct?
And you're absolutely right. There's so many different networks that you can create. And then the actual network connections to all the various components for management and automation. As we discovered, right, it's really easy to forget about one of those at some point, right? Because you got to interface with the registry, you got to interface with Kubernetes, you got to interface with whatever container engine you have, Docker being probably the most popular example, and all those pieces have to talk. And then you've got to spin up a lot of different containers, and they all have their networking architecture. And how do you know if something's not where it should be? And there's lots of open source and commercial products or projects that give you visibility into that in varying different levels, right? And you should definitely be considering this as you're building out your environments, right? Because it's so DevOps allows us to make mistakes much more quickly at scale. I think we said the same thing when we saw virtualization and then cloud and then containerization and now serverless, right? I think all of it is we're moving faster and have the potential to make more mistakes. And of course, the flip side of that is it allows us to apply a lot more granular levels of security and build security into the process. But again, the other edge of that sword is, there's a lot more points of failure, I think.
And part of that as well, in terms of, once you've got the whole, okay, are my network security connections good for my Kubernetes, orchestration layer? The other side of this as well is actually learning and tools number 2, HASH, or HASS SSH, recently released by Salesforce. So this was a very cool little project that they've recently open sourced as well, that it takes the whole idea of testing your network layer and actually looking at it as well from SSH going on inside of your environment. So it effectively will kind of tag every different SSH going on between like server clients and help you determine, hey, which ones do you actually want to allow? Like you should be able to SSH to certain servers for regular maintenance or for running certain tools, right? But once you've done that, you know what it is, you're pretty good, but you don't want to have random SSH tunneling outside of your network or between different systems for regular maintenance. Or if you're actually using proper DevOps workflows, you're never SSHing into your production instance ever. Like you rebuild your production instance, but you never actually SSH into it. So I thought this was another really cool tool for kind of network analysis. It's more intended for incident responders, but I think that it's something that I'm sure many of our listeners will want to maybe play around with, or help the ops teams get a understanding of, because it is, again, a bit of crypto, a bit of code, and of course a bit of just management of systems and networks. So I don't know if you checked anything out from this, Paul, but this was a pretty cool tool.
Yeah, there's so much out there like this, right, where you can get the basically elements of larger solutions, but open source. And you can take a lot of these projects. I like this project a lot, and tie that together with another open source project and start to build that into your workflow and your networks, or security architecture in general, and have some really good wins. Now, of course, the flip side of that is when you're implementing other people's open source projects, that comes with a lot of caveats and extra maintenance, such as I think the biggest reason is lack of any product management. I think going back to what I was said at the top of this segment is you tend to see features changed, removed, or modified without any clear-cut direction, and the developer thought it was cool, or we're just going to change things for whatever reason, and that could break your workflow, which is one reason why open source tends to be a little more work. But if you're willing to put that work in, you get so many features and functionality.
For sure. And especially when it comes to, security teams, especially on the application security side, where if you're looking for, ways to validate your test suites or ways to validate one tool against the other, run them all. I mean, they're all free open source. Like you might as well just try to run everything and then cross-validate where you can. Make sure that you're aggregating and deduplicating, perhaps even using, some of the paid tools. There are a few free tools out there that will help you do that from OWASP as well, which we'll highlight on a future episode of Application Security Weekly. But yeah, there's a lot of opportunity out there to use free open source software on the security side as well. You got to be a little bit more careful about what you're implementing internally in your environment from like a code library side.
Sure.
Speaking of, just kind of implementing things, I just want to point out food for thought number 3. It is, of course, our commit strip comic of the week. Go ahead and check that out under wiki.securityweekly.com, episode 38. It is going to be food for thought number 3. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us this week for another episode of Application Security Weekly. Remember to get commit and stay classy.